You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Love, exciting and new.
Hello, Hannah Waddingham here. Have you seen the fabulous new Sun Princess? World-class entertainment, exceptional dining, and the greatest pizza ever.
It's a love.
Don't miss our Come Aboard sale with up to 40% off and free room upgrades. Visit princess.com or call your travel advisor to book. Princess Cruises. Terms and restrictions apply. Offer ends 2/28/25. Ships of Bermudan and British Registry.
This episode is brought to you by Nerds Gummy Clusters, the sweet treat that always elevates the vibe. With a sweet gummy surrounded with tangy, crunchy nerds, every bite of Nerds Gummy Clusters brings you a whole new world of flavor. Whether it's game night, on the way to a concert, or kicking back with your crew, unleash your senses with Nerds Gummy Clusters.
Hello everyone and welcome to another set of older member episodes that are being released here on the main episode feed. This series of episodes covers the interwar Royal Navy, which seemed appropriate as the podcast is about to start its episodes on the Battle of Britain. In fact, that's what I'm working on right now, which is why you're hearing this. There will be 6 episodes in total released over the next 6 weeks as I get this next series on the Battle of Britain kind of sorted out, prepared, and ready for release. Thank you for your patience, and here's the episode. Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, Members Episode 15, The Royal Navy Part 5, Aviation. Before we get started today, we have to talk about a mistake on my part. When I sat down to start organizing my research notes for the upcoming series on the Munich crisis, I made a rather interesting discovery. In the long document of Munich crisis research notes, which would probably be 80 plus pages if you put it in a Word doc, there were 1,600 words worth of notes on the Royal Navy in 1937, the new standard of naval strength in the British pre-war naval building program. Obviously, this has little to do with the Munich crisis, and I just accidentally misfiled them in that big long document instead of the big long document for these Royal Navy episodes. So, what I have done is just bring them into this episode, even though they really should have been in episode 3. This also means that some of what will be discussed in the first 10-ish minutes or so of this episode might seem slightly familiar, but with new and interesting information mixed in. Then the final 2/3 of the episode will be discussing an entirely new set of topics, especially around the Royal Navy and aviation. In early 1937, the Admiralty set up a new committee, the Shipping Defense Advisory Committee, which was given the task of coordinating all of the aspects of trade defense, which would of course be critical in the time of war. Various subcommittees were created to deal with small topics, like how information would be communicated to ship owners, as well as really large topics like how and if a convoy system would be used. The usage of convoys for the protection of trade was a topic that had been far more hectic and divisive in the history of the Royal Navy than might be today expected. During the First World War, the Royal Navy had advocated against convoys for years, under the assumption that it would just concentrate the merchant ships and make them easier targets. They were also hesitant to stand up a system that would inevitably need naval resources in the form of convoy escorts. After convoys were belatedly introduced in 1917, they would prove to be effective at reducing the risk to shipping from enemy attack. But then after the war, the convoy system was once again questioned. The developments in Aztec and the increasing proficiency in offensive action against submarines seemed to point to a future in which it was much more dangerous for enemy vessels to attack any Allied shipping, and so they might be easily taken care of. One of the other problems that perhaps should be stated out loud is that there were few naval officers who really wanted to commit to a career in convoy defense. It was seen as unglamorous and boring when compared to, being a naval officer in the battle fleet or on the battleships, or even in the fleet destroyers that accompanied those larger ships. Wiser heads would prevail after 1935, though, and during the Shipping Defense Advisory Committee meeting, Admiral James would unequivocally state that the convoy system was the most effective organization for trade defense, providing the least risk to all kinds of enemy combatants. There would then be plans prepared to introduce convoys in some areas of the shipping lanes, and that there would then be escorts available to them as necessary. This would prove to be the correct stance, but there was the continued belief that some of these measures would not be necessary at the start of the next war. After the experiences of the First World War, it seemed very possible that an enemy, which, let's be honest here, was probably Germany, would not begin unrestricted trade warfare due to its inevitable disastrous consequences on relations with neutral powers, and especially the United States. Along with many discussions in committees like the Shipping Defense Advisory Committee, there were also real exercises happening for the Royal Navy during the interwar years. But we have something of a shortage of documents about these exercises because most of them were destroyed. We do know that the 1937 combined fleet exercises would last for a week and would involve a whole host of different scenarios that were deemed to be likely to occur during the war. This included submarine attacks, nighttime destroyer attacks, torpedo bomber attacks, and then various fleet cruising exercises. There were also many ships involved, a considerable portion of the entire strength of the Royal Navy, with 10 capital ships, 2 destroyers, 3 cruiser squadrons, and 5 destroyer flotillas. A few months later, there would be an important meeting that took place in London with the 1937 Imperial Conference, the first in 6 years. This meeting was important to the Royal Navy because many of the representatives at the conference from the Dominions were directly concerned with the Royal Navy's plan for a war with Japan. As we discussed in the previous episode, at this time the plan was for the base in Singapore to hold out until the fleet arrived from European waters. To say that there was some skepticism about this plan from the leaders of those areas in the Pacific that would be directly under attack would be an understatement. In particular, the representatives from Australia and New Zealand were very concerned about both the practicality and the chances of success of such a plan. The Admiralty stuck to its line, though, that it was the plan and that it would be successful. But in June, there would be a new report written about the situation in the Pacific, which began to cast some doubts. It would in some ways make for depressing reading, with the fleet expected to take 53 days to arrive, and that the air power of Japan outnumbered both the British and the Dominion air services in this area by quite some margin. But in others, it seemed quite upbeat, which was mainly down to the faith in the Royal Navy's superiority over the Imperial Japanese Navy, which was probably in no way warranted, but it was an optimistic view of the entire situation. This did not prevent the Navy from using the Far East as an excuse for expansion. And also on the heels of the Imperial Conference, the Admiralty would first consider the new standard of naval strength. This standard was set out in a paper and involved the expansion of the Royal Navy to a size that would allow both a large fleet to be sent to the Far East to face Japan, while at the same time providing enough strength that could be left at home to defend against European naval powers. To build up a fleet to this size would require a huge amount of construction. Here is Stephen Roskill from Naval Policy Between the Wars, the Period of Reluctant Rearmament, 1930 to 1939, to explain. Quote, "The size of the new standard navy was perhaps somewhat breathtaking, at any rate in Treasury eyes. It consisted of 20 capital ships, 15 aircraft carriers, 3 of which would be kept at long notice in peacetime and so require no aircraft, 100 cruisers, 22 flotillas of destroyers, which was some 198 boats, 82 submarines, and the usual proportion of smaller vessels. The total cost was estimated to be $104 million per year over and above normal Navy estimates, and it might total $800 million during the 7 years over which the expansion would be spread." End quote. While the expansion of the Royal Navy in the years that followed would be breathtaking, they would never come close to what was envisioned in the new standard. This was mostly attributable to the fact that the war started and most capital ship construction was halted. But if we look just at the 1937 year, 5 King George V class battleships and 4 Illustrious class aircraft carriers would be laid down in the span of just 12 months. At the same time, the number of smaller vessels would be greatly increased, with small ships being given absolute priority for construction in 1940 as the threat to trade reached a new peak. So they were kind of on their way to this much, much larger navy, if the war hadn't intervened. Along with this massive building program was perhaps another round of recognition of what was facing the Royal Navy in the case of another war. While there had always been considerations around the protection of home waters, the Mediterranean, and the Far East, a threat to all of them at the same time would leave even a much larger Royal Navy in a very tight spot. There were simply too many areas of the globe that had too high of a priority for defense. Obviously, the home waters could not be neglected, as it would be directly targeted by German trade interdiction. The Mediterranean could not be neglected, as it would be in that area that the Italian Navy would be attempting to support attacks in North Africa against Egypt, the Suez Canal, and even possibly the empire's oil sources in the Middle East. The Indian Ocean and India could also not be neglected, as it is an important part of British power in Asia. Finally, in the Pacific, an attack on Australia or New Zealand, two of the major pieces of the Dominion, would be a massive blow to prestige. There were attempts to mitigate some of these risks throughout the 1930s, which resulted in moves like the 1935 Anglo-German Naval Treaty, which we've discussed at length, and there were also lengthy discussions with the Americans about naval cooperation. The contents of these talks had to be very carefully balanced, as there was strong support in America to make sure that they were not brought into another European war. And there was also the fact that there was no official treaty between the two nations. Even with these facts, there were certainly many items where the two navies had similar interests, particularly in the Pacific, when facing Japan. One series of talks in early 1938 would allow the navies to coordinate communication between the fleets, including the sharing of communication codes and the cross-training of communication personnel. In many ways, the two navies had similar concerns and similar geographic problems in terms of far-flung possessions that needed to be defended. But in many details of their fleet construction, they were quite different. One of the most obvious was in aircraft carrier design. Entering the Second World War, the Royal Navy would be one of the only navies to possess carriers with armored flight decks. The decision to pursue this type of design was made quite early in the 1930s, and it was driven by particular technological issues that, at the time, were logical. The largest issue was how challenging it was to intercept airstrikes against a carrier. In the years before radar became more prevalent, the only way to know that a ship was going to be attacked from the air was to spot the aircraft with, good old Mark I eyeballs. It was possible that aircraft in the form of a combat air patrol could be used, but this was in no way guaranteed. And so it was very possible that the first people to spot an incoming raid would be on the ship itself. This presented an almost unsolvable, at least for the technology of 1936, geometry problem. Fighters simply could not get off the deck into altitude to intercept fast enough to keep an incoming strike away from the carrier. It was just not possible. This meant that the carrier would be attacked, and it would be hit, and it would take damage. And so the British would design their carriers around this idea. Armoring the flight deck was the answer, with the Royal Navy providing 3-inch armored decks that could protect against up to a 500-pound bomb. This seems kind of like a no-brainer, but it introduced other problems. An armored flight deck was much, much heavier than the deck of an unarmored carrier, and that weight had ramifications for how the rest of the ship could be designed. It needed far more support and far stronger hangar decks than were required in other carriers. This was acceptable to the Royal Navy because they had also made the decision to use closed hangar designs. This meant that the hangar deck was totally enclosed and was not an open-air design like those present in, say, American carriers. This closed-in design had its own positives and negatives. On the positive side, it provided much greater protection for the aircraft while the ship was at sea, and it made the design for the rest of the ship far simpler because a closed hangar made the entire ship more rigid. On the negative side, the planes could not be started and warmed up in the hangar and had to be moved to the flight deck before this could occur. In both decisions, armoring and enclosing, put constraints on the number of aircraft that the British carriers could carry. This limitation is maybe the area where the British carriers get the most criticism, because the difference in plane capacity between the Royal Navy carriers and the American carriers was in some cases pretty intense. For example, the USS Enterprise, laid down in 1934, could carry upwards of 90 aircraft, where the British carriers of the Illustrious class could carry only around half that number, depending on the carrier and the year of the war that you pull the number from. Obviously, this was a huge trade-off, and has been a topic of conversation ever since. The clear benefits and drawbacks, and then the completely different environments in which the British and American carriers would be active during the war, make direct comparisons very challenging. The cheeky answer would be to say that since both the Japanese and Americans began building armored carriers during the war, and then after the war closed hangars would be the standard, the Royal Navy was obviously correct. It was ahead of the times. But the truth is probably more nuanced, because just because something was correct in 1945 does not mean that it was correct in 1937.
This episode of History of the Second World War is sponsored by Acorns.
Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing, so your money has a chance to grow for you, your kids, and your retirement. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns will recommend a diversified portfolio that fits you and your money goals. You don't need to be rich. Acorns lets you invest with the spare money you've got right now. You can start with $5 or even just your spare change. It is, after all, a new year, and Acorns is a New Year's resolution that's easy to keep. It only takes about 5 minutes to open an account and to start automatically saving and investing your money so that it has a chance to grow. And the best part is that after you sign up, it can all happen automatically. So head over to acorns.com/SWWpod or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. Paid client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors LLC and SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/SWWpod.
Clorox Sentiva smells like grapefruit. Cleans like Clorox. And feels like...
Okay, we could be here all day. Try Clorox Sentiva for a trusted clean with long-lasting freshness. Also available in lavender and coconut. Use as directed.
The aircraft carriers themselves were just one part of the problem when it came to naval aviation. The other two would prove to be far more complicated, the planes and the pilots. In both cases, the problems experienced by the Royal Navy could be tracked back to a single source, the decision made to put the RAF in control of naval aviation. When it came to pilots, the fact that the pilots served in the RAF made it very challenging to fill the necessary positions. From the perspective of the Air Ministry and RAF pilots, they were reluctant to serve aboard ship. Meanwhile, naval officers were less inclined to opt to become pilots out of concern of possible promotional challenges. These concerns were legitimate, with the Air Ministry often resistant to moving naval officers above a certain level of promotion. This meant that even after 1932, when a 3-week training course was arranged for all junior naval officers in the hope of tempting some of them into the air, filling seats was very problematic. It was simply very hard to shake the belief that it was better for a young officer to pick a more traditional specialty. On the technical side of aircraft development, relations between the two services was by all accounts, pretty solid. This meant that in general, the types of aircraft that the Navy wanted to build were designed and built, but there were always prioritization problems, at least if you were looking at it from the side of the Royal Navy. Priority became particularly important after rearmament started in earnest because there simply were not enough factories and working hours to go around. And when push came to shove, the Air Ministry had a tendency to favor bomber and fighter command over the Navy. During the 1930s, the problems with this arrangement became a greater and greater concern for the Royal Navy, as the belief that air power would continue to be more important than the naval sphere in the years to come became more and more entrenched. This put the problems with pilots and production priority in even greater relief as the two services entered full-blown rearmament after 1936. First Sea Lord Chatfield, who would be in his position for most of these political squabbles, would say, quote, "Of all the battles which I have faced, there was only one which gave me real anxiety, namely control of the fleet air arm." As it should happen, the shift in control of the fleet air arm would not occur until just shortly before the war. The late date of this shift in control would not be due to lack of trying. In the early 1930s, First Lord of the Admiralty Alexander would write, quote, "The fleet air arm exists for the Navy. Its machines are designed to meet naval requirements and are paid for by the naval vote. It will be required to operate with the fleet at any point of the world in which the fleet is needed. For all practical purposes, therefore it is an integral part of the Navy." End quote. By 1936 and 1937, the relationship between the Air Ministry and the Royal Navy over the matter of the fleet air arm was getting downright toxic. By the time of the INSCIP reports, Chatfield would claim that the Air Ministry was actively working against a government inquiry into the matter. Chatfield would go so far as to float the idea of resignation from his position of First Sea Lord unless an official inquiry was held. Eventually, this inquiry would be set up, with Inskip, Halifax, and Stanley being its primary members. The report that was generated was almost entirely driven by Inskip, and it was quite favorable to the Navy's position. It was published in July 21st, 1937, and I've pulled some excerpts from this report. Quote, "The use of aircraft in connection with naval operations, and in particular the organization of the Fleet Air Arm, have been the subject not only of a prolonged controversy, but repeated inquiries. The two services directly concerned are in such sharp disagreement as to the principles on which a sound policy should be based with regards to the use of aircraft by or for the purpose of the Navy. The Admiralty say that a number of naval functions are now performed in suitable circumstances by an improved method, that is to say, by aircraft instead of seagoing ships. The functions, however, remain naval, and to carry them out efficiently, it is necessary to specialize in the training of the personnel and in the design of the aircraft. The air unit in a carrier or in a capital ship is a great deal more than a passenger in a convenient vehicle. It forms part of the organization of the ship, and as such is a factor in the efficiency of the ship. I find it impossible to resist the inference that when so much that concerns the air units depends upon the naval element in the ship and in the fleet, the Admiralty should be responsible for selecting and training the personnel, and generally for the organization of the Fleet Air Arm." End quote. This cemented the path of the shift of the Fleet Air Arm over to the Royal Navy, but in no way solved all the problems inherent with such a transition. While trying to take over operations from the RAF, a huge personnel problem developed where the Navy needed not just pilots, but all the other personnel required to make the Fleet Air Arm function. There was a transfer of many officers over to the Navy to prevent immediate problems, but the Navy also had to stand up the training processes for future generations. This would take time, but by the middle of 1938, the first new officers had started training, and the first raiding pilots had also began their training. By the time that the war was declared, the Royal Navy was able to at least man all of the planes that it had both aboard ship and among shore-based squadrons, but it took basically every trained pilot available. While forgotten is probably too strong of a word, certainly less discussed in the relation to naval aviation during the interwar years were the aircraft that were not on the aircraft carriers, but were instead positioned on other ships of the fleet. In the mid-1920s, the official policy of the Royal Navy was that each battleship should have a turret catapult on the X-turret and then a quarterdeck turret, and smaller ships should also be equipped with some arrangement of catapult-launched aircraft. The planes that were launched from these catapults were seaplanes that would then land near the ship before being hauled aboard via some sort of crane system. There would be many battleships and cruisers that had such catapults fitted during the 1920s and early 1930s, but they became something of a divisive topic even while these were being fitted. The primary purpose of the catapult-launched planes was spotting and scouting. They would be equipped with radios and would seek out the direction and location of enemy ships or spot the fall of rounds that were being fired from the ship's guns. There were some suggestions for ships that launched far more catapult-launched aircraft, like a design in March 1931 which would have carried 18 torpedo bombers. But at least for the British, these designs did not get off the drawing boards, although they would for the Japanese. While the idea of spotting and reconnaissance was good in theory, and even played out well in some exercises, there were always many concerns about if such an arrangement would be practical in a real combat environment. There were two primary problems: enemy aircraft and incidental damage. Both pilots and other naval officers raised concerns about the vulnerability of the British planes if they became the target of enemy aircraft. The catapult-launched planes were seaplanes, which reduced their overall performance in comparison to other combat aircraft. There were also problems of numbers. Even in the 1930s, when dedicated fighter aircraft began to be added to ship complements, they would always be greatly outnumbered by any determined enemy attack. The other problem was how vulnerable the planes were when on board the ships. The larger ships had enclosed hangars in which to hold the aircraft, but even in those cases, there were serious concerns about how easy it would be to damage either the planes or the catapults, rendering them both useless. It did not help that the planes just added other things that could cause fire aboard ship or even cause explosions. It also simply required weight and space to store the aircraft and their equipment that could have been used for something else. All of these concerns became more pronounced in the mid-1930s as the number of enemy aircraft that might be attacking the ships continued to increase, while the number of catapult planes largely remained the same. There would also be several high-ranking naval officers that supported both catapult-launched reconnaissance and fighter aircraft, and so the policy would persist into the war years. They would continue to overrule those who advocated for a shift away from catapult aircraft, with that space instead being taken up by more anti-aircraft armament or other items. The experience of the war would prove that the second category of officer, the ones that were quite skeptical, were closer to correct. Ships during the war would find it challenging to get the proper use out of their catapult-launched planes, and they proved to be a danger to the ships that they were stationed on. In fact, during the war years, many ships that came in for major refits had their catapults removed for such mission-critical items as a theater for the men and laundry rooms, and other such items. Next episode, the final one in the Royal Navy series, we will look at the Royal Navy's preparations for war, as well as some discussion about the war itself.